invite a conversation with Deepika, who has been incredibly open about her own history, about her own story. And there'll be many, many more stories to tell. And thank you very much. It's an honor.
First of all, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and doing our very first inaugural lecture series. For someone who's seen mental illness very, very closely, and you spoke about how the stigma towards cancer was actually led by lay people, in a sense, where society sort of came together and helped bring it forward. How in India do you think that we stigmatize mental illness, and how do you think we can overcome that in the Indian context?
Well, I think you've done a lot yourself, Deepika. So I think, first of all, an important congratulations to you. You begin, I think, one begins all these journeys in a confessional mode. There are no patients, and this is an important thing to realize, there are no patients who are not people. The word patient is an abstraction. Humans, people are individuals. So you begin there. You begin by telling your story. I think of myself as a storyteller, not only as a scientist, but also as a physician and also as a writer. You begin by telling the story. You begin by telling your story. You tell your story to your mother. You tell your story to your father. You tell your story to your children. You incite their stories. And these stories then begin to circulate across time and space. And you've done this yourself. So I think the first step is to create the safety and the security that comes with allowing yourself to tell your own story or other people's stories, and make it possible to tell that story without, as I said, blame and victimhood. That is the personal. But that personal agenda, that personal strategy, is only successful if it's supported broadly by social and political changes, as I described, and of course by biologic insights, by scientific insights. So as you tell that story, one finds oneself, you find yourself joined by other forces. You'll find allies everywhere. People you thought that didn't exist come out of the woodwork, and they begin to become your allies. They tell you that, gosh, I've been working on this forever, and here's what I found. I found, a physician might say, here are some patterns that I found. When take a disease or take an illness like postpartum depression, it was not even characterized as an illness several decades ago. The number of women who will experience postpartum depression, an illness that we do not understand, that will drive them towards near suicidality. Yeah, this is, in other words, 50% of the population of human beings, of which some 20-odd% have had a child, of which some 10% will experience a devastating illness that will drive them to suicidality, was not even listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is one of the fundamental journals or one of the fundamental Bibles of psychiatry, neuropsychiatry, until several decades ago, because no one spoke about it. Now there is a whole interest in what are the neurohormonal changes that accompany pregnancy and birth, and a biological understanding. If you go to any place on the planet, really, you will find other people, other women who've suffered from this disease, postpartum depression. You will find ways to cope. You will find ways to talk. You will find ways to communicate. And there is a vast biological enterprise that is trying to understand why these hormonal changes cause this terrible and devastating illness. So this is to say that all the solutions to all illnesses, the solutions to all problems occur in an ecosystem. And that ecosystem has to evolve. It takes time to evolve. And you've done a lot to push that ecosystem to evolve. It's up to the rest of us to help you along. You've told your story. We need to tell our stories to help you in evolving the ecosystem around it.
You've worked very closely with cancer and with cancer patients. And is it safe to assume that emotionally and mentally that's something that there's emotional and mental turmoil that they go through as well? And what is done to sort of tackle that while, say, someone's experiencing cancer and going through therapy? And so what is the mental state of that person at that time?
Well, it varies a lot. Some people come into the clinic, thinking of themselves as fighters and soldiers. Others are more resigned. There's a big variation, of course, in people. One of the reasons that doctors are doctors is that we treat human beings as individuals and not as collectives or as abstractions. There's a big variation. But the reality is that cancer is a terrifying diagnosis across the board. And understanding and empathizing with patients individually takes a separate set of skills. It takes a set of skills that are developed over time. You have to learn how to do it. There is no one-size-fits-all model, much like there is not in neuropsychiatry. And one of the great things we've learned over time is that people have very different approaches. Some people are resigned. Some people want the most aggressive therapy. And you have to create a kind of bond with them. I call it an atomic bond, because the relationship between an individual and their oncologist is extraordinarily close. In fact, the only other mirror for this, ironically, or perhaps not ironically, is a relationship between a patient and his or her psychiatrist. There is that same kind of atomic bond that exists, and it will never go away. It never goes away if you find the right person. So, treating a cancer patient involves obviously not just the medical therapy, the surgical and oncological chemotherapy that accompanies, but we are now increasingly reliant on psychiatry, psycho-oncology, palliative care, and other disciplines to help us with patients with cancer.
Okay. Which leads me to my next question, which was, particularly in India, and we at the Live Love Laugh Foundation believe that general practitioners really are the first line of defense when it comes to mental illness, because with people struggling with mental illness, a lot of the symptoms are physical symptoms. Why is it then that sort of correlation between physical and mental health is often overlooked? So say if I go to a general practitioner with a stomach bug or any other physical symptom, he's most often going to try and treat me for that, versus trying to find the correlation between my mental health and physical health. Why do you think that happens, and what do you think we can do in India to sort of overcome that challenge?
Well, I think it's a historical challenge, and the challenge arises from a very biomedical model of health. If you look at the history of the brain broadly, that history can be divided into two camps. One camp is a camp of people who originated historically with the belief that the brain is a series of wires. and a series of circuits. These were the electrophysiologists. And then there's a second group of people who believe that the brain is a mush of chemicals. These were the chemical scientists. And for decades, the field of psychiatry and the field of neuropsychiatry has struggled between these two models of the brain. Of course, both are correct. The brain is simultaneously a series of electrical circuits, but also a mush of chemicals that is influenced by the rest of the body. More recently, a sort of third wave has emerged, appropriately, which says that the brain is integrated with the rest of the body. That it's not separate, it's not a blob of gray matter sitting in a box that happens to be your skull, but in fact is highly integrated with the rest of your body, and that illnesses that affect one part of your body ultimately feed back to the brain, and the brain ultimately feeds back to the rest of these illnesses. It is a tougher model because it's more integrative. It acquires insights from ecology. It acquires insights from physiology, from neurophysiology, and ultimately asks questions that are very deep questions, which is, what is the relationship between the brain and the intestines, the brain and other organs? What is the phenomenon? What is the phenomenon of depression look like in terms of an organismal illness? Not just as a bog of chemicals in your brain. What does the phenomenon of depression look like as an organismal illness? Why is it, for instance, that people who are severely depressed and have deep organic depression often find organic symptoms in their bodies? They can't eat. Or people who are anxious can't have the physiology of they have all sorts of problems with, among other things, cardiac disease. So these relations were ignored for a long time, but have now come to light as we have moved away from this sort of brain as a box of chemicals or a brain as a box of wires idea. This will take time. It requires a lot of sophistication. It requires systems biology. It requires a systems analytic way of thinking. But just to finish up, it's really important to get insights from both physicians and from patients. Because patients will tell you. Patients will tell you what their symptoms are. You can decide not to record them. You can decide not to write them. But they will tell you what their symptoms are. They will tell you, gosh, I'm depressed and I have digestive symptoms. And you can say, God, I'm going to just ignore the digestive symptoms and pretend that your brain's a little box in a skull. Patients with cancer will tell you, I mean, this is a classic example. This has been going on for decades. Patients with pancreatic cancer will tell you that they have depression, severe intractable depression. We have known this for decades. I've treated dozens of patients with pancreatic cancer. They will tell you, I have severe intractable depression, and it preceded my diagnosis with pancreatic cancer. I have no idea why. No one knows why. There is a neurohormonal circuit, I suspect, that creates this kind of prodrome of depression with pancreatic cancer. I don't know why. It's not true for other cancers. It's uniquely true for pancreatic cancer. We can decide not to record it. I wrote a long piece on this for the New York Times Magazine. We can choose to ignore it and push it away. But it's real. Patients are telling you this. They're coming to your office and saying, Dr. Mukherjee, long before I was diagnosed, I had a prodrome in which I felt profoundly depressed, and I didn't know why. And you can say, gosh, I'm just going to write that away. Or you can say, that's a matter of, this is something that reason can solve, that science can solve. Anyway, that's a long answer to your question. But the way to move forward is to really apply a more integrative model to all of these sciences.
What do you do for your mental health? Or what do people what do doctors do for their mental health? And I think considering globally and in India and globally especially, we see it everywhere, the high rate of burnout amongst professionals. Do people find the time? What do they do for their mental health?
Well, I can tell you what I do for mental health because I sag. I have a very particular pattern. So I sag by the end of the day. By the end of every day of my practice, I sag, and the clouds come very clearly at about 5 to 6 p.m. I have a seasonal affective disorder as well. I've done everything. I have a lamp in my room, I have etc. But what really helps, I have to say, is exercise. So I try to run, and that is one thing I do. And the second thing is I spend the evening usually with scientists in my laboratory and with my family describing my day. And often, I have no fear of crying, by the way. Often it will end in tears. I'm not afraid of it. I don't think it's, there is I have no fear of of masculinity in crying. And I will say I had a really hard day. I saw a 40-year-old woman who was about to die. I tried to administer palliative care. I failed. My trial failed. This failed. My credit card didn't work. The treadmill was broken. And, it was a horrible day. So I think the capacity to look inside, to look inwards, and not to create a painted face. And this goes back to this problem that my daughter had identified. The number of painted faces has increased so dramatically in our society that we can't tell our real face anymore. We don't know what the real face looks like. Everyone's face is painted. And so the capacity to come back to friends, to family, to people who you love, people who you have a connection with, and to say, this is not the painted face, this is the real face, I think is a powerful, for me, a powerful antidepressant. It is a powerful mode to rid myself of anxiety. It doesn't do everything. This is just to remind ourselves that I'm a big believer in psychopharmacology. Medicines help. If you are in the place that you need medicines, they do help. Seek help. In cancer, just to create the analogy, you can't wish the cancer away. You can't say, I'm going to wish the cancer away. The purpose of medicine is to help. And I'm a big psychopharmacology, by that I mean psychiatric medicines for anxiety and depression are not ideal. We have not invented the best medicines that we would like to invent with the least amount of side effects. But if you're in that situation that you need professional help, don't be ashamed. Seek professional help and seek medicines. There is no stigma. There is no problem. Maybe it won't work for you, but medicines help.
Yeah. Do you think funding is essential? I think funding played a very essential role in where cancer is today in terms of research, in terms of awareness, in terms of cure. Where do you see funding for mental health going? What stage do you think we're at? How do you think we can better that? And how do you think it can obviously benefit the cause?
Look, I mean, money always helps. There is no doubt about it. I mean, to some extent, research is labor. Labor is driven by money. The capacity to attract the most brilliant men and women who will make a change depends on us being able to provide them with the resources.
How did cancer go about doing that?
So what happened was it was a slow release, as it were. The war on cancer helped. The campaign against cancer has helped. They were extraordinarily helpful. The the budget of the National Institutes of Health has a budget of $50 billion now. Now that sounds like a big number, but just to contrast it, it is a fraction of a fraction of what the Iraq war cost, which was several trillion dollars. So researchers survive on a budget of, fundamental researchers working in academic hospitals survive on a budget of about $50 billion, of which the National Cancer Institute in the United States takes about 15 to 20 billion. It's one of the largest chunks of that. It's supplemented by philanthropy. It's supplemented, of course, by other sources of money. The National Institute of Mental Health has now increased its budget and has continued to increase its budget. So, of course, I think money helps. I think it has helped all along. I think the money is driven by public interest. If you want increased interest in mental health, if you want increased attention to mental health, the way to do this is to fund more and more in-depth research on mental health. That has to be a public enterprise. The National Institutes of Health, the National Institute of Mental Health in the world, in the country, in India, don't arise out of the vacuum. They are mandates created by the voting public. It's your tax dollars, as it were, or tax rupees, as it were, that are contributing to these institutes. These institutes then have these as mechanisms to fund in-depth research. And that in-depth research ultimately translates, in a perfect world, translates into medicines for human health. You will never hear from me that any illness is overfunded. And you will certainly not hear from me that illnesses such as depression, schizophrenia, postpartum depression, anxiety are overfunded. They're chronically underfunded.
And finally, what would you say to all of us at the Live, Love, Love Foundation that wake up every morning and work towards giving hope to those struggling with stress, anxiety, and depression? What would you say to us, and where would you like to see us, say, 5-10 years from now?
Well, I would like to see the foundation making deep inroads into all aspects of society in India. The public advertising campaigns are one start, but you have recognized, and all of us have recognized, the depth of the problem. It is compounded by discrimination across gender and sexual orientation. Those are extraordinary problems, and they are endemic problems. These problems, in other words, the burden of mental health and the burden of taking care of people with mental health falls, we know this from large statistical surveys, on women disproportionately on women. And then they become burdened with mental health issues themselves. So this is not to say that men don't suffer from mental health problems, but the disproportionate burden of taking care of children and adults with mental health issues in this country and in countries across the world fall disproportionately on women. I would like very much to see a women's health program within the mental health practice. I would like to see that initiated by you. I would like to see that funded by the government. I would like to see central input on that. I would like to see that program succeed. I would like to see that program succeed in rural India. I would like to see that program. I'm just setting out your challenges, and I'll call you in 5 years. I'll call you in 5 years.
I mean, we can disagree as well, and we can be on a completely different path, but the inputs are most welcome.
Yes, you can disagree, but you would be wrong. But look, we have to agree on some things, and that is that the burdens are disproportionately fall on one gender. So I would like to see a specific program, a directed program on women's mental health, which you've already launched, I know, and there's lots of interest. And I would like to see this as part of a global health program, which you integrate into, because the lessons learned from India are applicable to wherever you want in the world, all from, Appalachia in the United States to Mali in Africa to Greenland in which we were going to buy at some point of time, but are really applicable. So I would like to see this program flourish, but in particular, I would like to see a particular focus on those who bear the deepest burdens of mental health.